Welcome back, everybody, from lunch. We're going to start our next session. So I'm going to stop my shares. She can start, and we are recording. So this is Hillary. Is it Bauer?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I rarely meet someone with my same name, same pronunciation. So just wanted to make sure. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, I just need to screen share here and then I'll get started. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Yeah, all right. Well, thank you so much and to the Office of E-Learning for having me today. I really appreciate it, this opportunity. So today we're going to be talking about designing grading rubrics. I'm looking forward to talking to some of you and meeting some of you who I don't know yet today and discussing this with you all. So just a little bit about me before we get started. So my background, I teach in teacher education first. I'm an associate professor in the Office of Teacher Education, and specifically I work in inclusive early childhood education. I got my bachelor's in child development and early childhood special education at WU. I also got my master's there in educational psychology and my PhD there in interdisciplinary education. So that's some of my background in education. And then professionally, beyond higher ed, I've worked in a couple of different settings. So I worked as a preschool teacher in an inclusive classroom with kids with autism and kids who are typically developing as well. I also did some ABA therapy with kids with autism. And then I also worked in birth with Read, if any of you are familiar with that. But for the last 6 years, this will be my 6th year, I guess, this coming year, I've worked at West Liberty. And then before that, I also worked in higher ed as an adjunct as well at WU. So here's some of the topics we're going to cover today. So first, we'll go over the definition of rubrics and benefits of utilizing rubrics within your classrooms or your courses, elements of rubrics, best practices in designing rubrics, and then the steps in designing a rubric.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but I'm not seeing it move to the next slide. It's still on your first slide.
Well, thank you. No, I really appreciate that. Don't apologize. See if I can figure out why it's doing that. See if I hit resume share. Did that help at all? No.
This happened with our first presenter as well. It got stuck on his first slide and wouldn't move.
I wonder if he was using Canva. Was he also using Canva? Do you know?
No, he was using PowerPoint.
Okay.
I do have a copy of PDF if you want me to show it while you talk.
You're welcome to do that. I have a couple links, so I don't know if maybe later on for the links I can show that part, but beyond that, that should be okay.
So you're on.
That was just on the agenda slide. I guess that's
Agenda
number
slide.
3.
Okay, so there you go. Is this one it?
Yes, thank you. So again, we will go over the definition. I guess I'll start from the beginning. So what we're going to be discussing today is the definition and benefits of utilizing rubrics, the elements of rubrics, some of the best practices in how to design rubrics, and then the steps that you'll take in designing a rubric. You can go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So Cabin 2019 defined rubrics as a coherent set of criteria for students' work that includes descriptions of levels of performance and quality on the criteria. So you have different criteria areas, and then you have levels. And then with that as well, we'll talk about how those levels are defined, which is your descriptors. So the first thing we'll discuss here is the benefits of using rubrics. So why should you utilize rubrics in your classrooms, in your courses? So first, they decrease grading time. So if you utilize rubrics, you're going to spend a lot less time in crafting and forming individualized feedback for students. So even though you're still going to provide some individualized feedback and comments, each area or criteria area within your assessment has its own area and has levels. So rather than having to write out all of that information, it's already included in the rubric, and students can kind of see where they fall based on that rubric. So it really saves a lot of time. The crafting the rubric does take some time initially, but later on it really pays off in grading time. It also improves objectivity and consistency in grading. So when you're providing that individual feedback without a rubric, you might change inadvertently. Usually it's not intentional, but you might change that feedback and the way you're grading from one student to the next. In addition, your own perceptions of a student, whether that be positive, you've had really positive interactions with that student or negative interactions with that student, could influence your grading. And when you have a rubric that has clearly defined levels, it does decrease some of that bias, that grader bias that could factor into how you're grading one student to the next. It also clearly communicates those levels and how you're grading to the students. So there's less ambiguity from one student to the next and how you're grading. And students can also use those rubrics whenever they are crafting their assignment. So they can see not just what the instructions are for that assignment, but exactly what they need to do in each of those criteria areas to get the grade that they're wanting, and to really be able to show that they are meeting those learning objectives for the assignment. That gets me to the last area. It informs both the instructor and the students on how you are meeting those learning goals. So when you create your course, you have goals for the course. Hopefully that didn't cut it off there. It looks a little bit slightly different there at the bottom than what it did on my screen. So I apologize if it cut off the bottom. There you go. Thank you. I appreciate that. So again, it informs the teachers and the students on how they're meeting those course objectives. So when you craft your course, you have objectives, right, within that syllabus. And part of what the rubric can do is really narrow down those course objectives into more specific objectives beneath that from those course objectives. So they're able to see, based on how I scored on this assignment, am I meeting those overall course objectives? And they can see, what improvements might they need to make. Another thing that you can really do from rubrics is utilize not only your course objectives, but those standards that you might follow. So for us in teacher education, we have specific state and national standards that we follow, but for other professions, you have those as well. So you can utilize those state and national standards, and those standards can be used to form your criteria areas. And again, students can really see, okay, how am I performing on this assessment? And how does that show if I can meet those objectives on those state or national standards? So there are three primary elements to rubrics. So there's the performance criteria. And again, those areas are typically aligned to your objectives on your syllabus, your course objectives, and also state or national standards for your professional area. Then you have performance levels, and then performance level descriptors. So performance level descriptors really describe those different levels in the performance levels. So the first area, performance criteria. So this is really your rows of your rubric. When you are designing your rubric, those are those rows. And again, they are going to align to course objectives. So when you're designing your course and making that syllabus, all of your assignments and the performance criteria within that should align to those overall objectives of your course. And just be a little more specific. So here's some examples I have here. So if one of the course assignments, for instance, is to craft a research paper, two of the criteria within that might be organization of the paper and then APA style. So we use APA style in our area, but there's other types as well. So you might use, Chicago or MLA, but those are two examples of performance criteria areas that you might have within that rubric. So it's really kind of categories, right, within the rubric. And then you have performance levels. So within those categories or those performance criteria, you have various levels. So those are going to be the columns within your rubric. And those describe different achievement levels within that criteria area. So if you're looking at that previous example and APA style, one student may have really done well in their use of APA style, so they achieve the highest level, where another student maybe made a few errors and they're on the next level. Maybe another student didn't really utilize APA style at all and they're on the lowest level. So it's various levels within that category or criteria area. And with those levels or those columns, you have either numerical or written values. So you've probably seen both utilized, and sometimes you might even have both. You might have a number and with that also a written descriptor, but you want to have at least one or the other. So for instance, you might have meets and meets below and high achievement or something along those lines, or you might have, you know, a 30, a 15, and a 0, right? So you have various levels, either numerically or in written descriptions within those columns. You can go ahead to the next one. And then finally, you have your performance level descriptors. So those are really your written descriptions of those various levels that I just described. So in addition to having those numbers, you want to have a written description that's very clear about how they're going to either get, you know, the lowest level, the medium, modest level, or the highest level. So you know exactly what they need to do, and students know exactly what they need to do to achieve whichever area they're hoping to achieve. You want these to be clear and, sorry, you want these to be clear and measurable. So you want to use terminology that's more clear. One thing that can be helpful for these is using things like numbers. So for instance, with the APA style, as an example that I used before, within the level, you might say a specific number of errors that they made, right? So maybe the highest level of achievement, they only made, you know, 1 or 2 errors. The moderate level, they made, you know, 3 to 5 errors, et cetera. So you can really be clear in exactly how to score those areas by using specific either terminology or numbers, but be very clear and make sure it's objective within those levels. Thank you. You can go on now. So best practices in designing those 3 areas. You want to have at least 2 or more performance criteria. So remember, those are those categories that we were looking at before. You want to have at least 3 to 5 performance levels. So those are those different areas that we just talked about, either numerically, or those are the either numerically or written out descriptors. And then you want those levels to be clear. So you want to make it very clear to both students and to the person who's grading or the instructor how there's distinctions between one level and the next. And again, that can be where it's helpful to be really specific in those levels and either describe, you know, numbers or specifics. For instance, if they're having to make comparisons, you can say, you know, the student made at least one clear comparison or something along those lines. So it's very clear exactly what they need to do in each area. And then you want to make sure that your rubric is testing relevant skills. So make sure that your rubric, again, one way to do that is to make sure that your rubric and your assessment is aligned to your course objectives. Is that assessment really aligned? Is it testing something within your course objectives? And again, that's when you're designing your course as well. You want to make sure that your course and your course objectives are also then aligned to your professional standards. So again, mine is education, but if you're teaching a course on nursing, or if you're teaching a course on speech pathology, you want to make sure whatever that area is that you're aligning your course and your assessments to those standards. All right, and then here are the steps in designing a rubric. So the first step that you want to do is determine your student learning goals. So really that's those objectives for the assessment. So again, once you have created your course, whether that's an online course or an in-person course, hybrid course, you want to make sure that your assessments are aligning to those course objectives that you created at the beginning of the course when you created that syllabus. From there, you can identify criteria. And again, the criteria should be more narrowed down than those overall assessment objectives. You want to make sure that all of your criteria is meeting all the goals of that assessment. Again, make sure that you have at least 2 criteria for your assessment, and that's aligned to those goals and objectives. Then the next thing you want to do, number 3, is identify those levels. Those can be either numerical or textual, and you want to have at least 3 levels. We'll look at the one of the other slides before. I think we already looked at it. Said 3 to 5. So it's okay if you have more than 3, but you want to have at least 3. So somewhere between 3 and 5. You don't want to have so many that it kind of gets overwhelming to the grader or to the student. So 3 to 5 is the best amount for those levels. And then finally, you want to rate your descriptors. So really, this is where you're going to be able to determine as a grader and as a student, what are the distinctions between those levels? How do I know if I want to achieve the highest level in that area? Again, if it's making comparisons, we'll say, between sources in a research paper, how do I know what I need to do in order to achieve that highest level? You want to be very clear and distinct in your rating of those levels, and make sure the terminology and wording of those is very objective. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. And then the last step, which is not including on that timeline of the steps, but is equally as important, is that you want to really keep testing that rubric once you're using it. So you don't want to kind of stay stagnant and use that rubric and never make any changes to it. You want to keep evaluating. Is it effective? Is it really testing what I'm looking at? So as you're using it, keep looking at student performance. You know, what are the performance levels of the students? Does it really reflect the learning goals of my class and of the assessment? And then the weighting. So is the weighting for various performance criteria? So remember, we talked about some examples there of what performance criteria looks like. Is the weighting consistent with what I want them to achieve? So for instance, looking back at our previous example, maybe the weighting of APA style is 50%, but that's not really a primary goal of the course. If the weighting of APA style is 50%, but it's not a primary goal of the course, that might need to be reevaluated, right? Maybe that should be weighted lower than that. It shouldn't be as high of the level of that assessment. And then finally, inter-rater reliability is another important factor. So if you're teaching a course that has multiple instructors, or if you're teaching a course that's yourself and GAs who are teaching it, you want to make sure that your grading is consistent between graders. So you can do mock grading, or you can grade assignments and kind of look between to make sure that you're consistent. And that's another way that you can see are your areas really objective. You know, if one person is scoring it completely different than another, the terminology and your descriptors within your criteria might not be as clear as you thought it was, right? If there's a lot of variation between one grader and the next. So that might be another really good indicator that those descriptors need to be narrowed down. They need to be more refined and more objective than what you originally created. So don't just stop. Once you've created a rubric, I have created rubrics and changed them lots of times. I'm pretty much always recreating rubrics, which is difficult as the instructor, but I know a lot of you probably are doing that as well. Since you're all teachers who are trying to further your knowledge, you're probably people who are changing them frequently as well, but you do want to keep changing them as you see necessary. And I do have a link that I was hoping to show. I'm not sure if I can maybe try to share my screen and show the link. Is that okay? Okay. See if I can. See if I can get back to it. Can you all see this here? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is a really great resource, this table from Arizona State University. They created this table to utilize that you can kind of look and see, do you meet those areas? So this is one of the resources that I utilized for both my courses, but also for this presentation. You can see, do you meet those best practices or not? So I know these visuals and tables like this can be helpful. So it shows some of the best practices. Are there at least 3 to 5 performance levels? You can kind of check yes or no. Are the levels distinct? Yes or no. Are there 2 or more performance criteria? And again, are those distinct? And then for the performance level descriptors, you can see, are they objective, measurable? Are they clearly articulated? And then finally, for this one, are they for a given row, the descriptors evaluate the same criterion across the different performance levels? So you want to make sure that for those different areas, the different levels are still evaluating the same thing, that they don't change over time. It's still looking at that same area. And then finally, it's looking at representing meaningful differences across performance levels. So again, you want to make sure that those are distinct areas, that students wouldn't be confused about how are those any different from one another, those different levels. So again, that's really helpful. There's one more link. I don't know if I can see if I can get to it. I have a lot. There are open educational resources is the other thing I wanted to share with you all as well. I think it's in one of the references. If I can get back to that, let me see. Sometimes I like Canva, but sometimes it can be more difficult to share. I don't know if that's shared. If I can get to my references. Stop share here. Can you pull my presentation back up? That might be the easiest way.
What slide do you need?
The reference slide, the last slide.
Reference. Okay.
Thank you. So I believe it's this first reference, the American Association of Colleges and Universities value rubrics. But there are links provided in some of these to get to open educational resource rubrics. So you can utilize those. I would always suggest you cite them and make it clear to students that you're using those, that you didn't create that. But there are open educational resource rubrics that have already been evaluated. They've already been looked at to make sure that they're meeting those different criteria and best practices and rubrics. And there are lots of different categories and content areas. So a lot of times there are specific ones that could align to your courses. And even if you don't decide to use them, they're a good starting point to kind of see what exactly should a rubric look like, and how should I design it to meet those best practices. That was the only other thing I wanted to share with you all. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Hillary, a couple things. And for those of you that work at West Liberty, we actually have in Sakai some template rubrics that we've created for different things. And our writing rubric, we actually based off the AACU rubric. So, you know, we looked at it, modified it, added points, those sorts of things. So we do have some rubric samples in Sakai if you would like to take advantage of those. I do have one question that I'm hoping you can address for the group, because it's something that we see a lot. People will design a rubric, and then for their performance, their criteria, they will have about 6 separate things in the same block. So then it becomes, how do you grade that when you have 6 different things that you're looking for? So I was just wondering what kind of advice you could give, because I've had folks tell me over the years that, you know, work in education, you know, really you should narrow that down to maybe just one thing or 1 or 2 things, because putting too many things in there, again, increases the unreliability of the rubric.
Right. And that's one of the points that was mentioned in those best practices, that you want to make sure that those are distinct areas and that you don't have too many within one. So I would follow what you said to only include one. And there's not, again, you don't have too many, but it says at least 2, and it's better to have more criteria areas and have them be more distinct. Especially, again, a lot of you do have multiple people who do grading, whether that be GAs, or you have other, so like the English classes, for instance, where you have multiple sections, or if you're teaching a course has multiple instructors, it's best to have it be as objective as possible and have it be as small of a description as possible. So sometimes, again, you want to make sure that, I think that was one of the points that I mentioned within that, is that if you have, you know, a row and then your areas get to be paragraphs long, is all of that really even testing that at that point? Right. It's not, right? It's really looking at other areas. So you need to look sentence by sentence really and see, is that sentence even looking at that criteria area? Is it looking at that category at all? Or is it really testing something else?
Thank you.
That's a really good point. Thank you.
I have a quick question. It's actually for Mary Lee. Where are the sample rubrics located?
The sample rubrics, so if you go into the rubrics tool, down on the bottom where it says publicly shared rubrics,
Where is the rubrics tool on
The
Sakai?
rubrics tool is if you are in any course,
Okay.
if you go into that left-hand column, there should be a tool in there that says rubrics. And
That's so
then-
funny. I've never noticed that link there. That is totally my fault. That's really funny. I feel like I just say hide from student if it's not a link that I'm using, and I just
Yeah.
wasn't even paying attention.
So when you click into that tool, the top of the rubric, the top of the tool on the screen that comes up in the middle of your page will be any active rubrics you have in your course. And then on the bottom are any publicly shared rubrics. So for example, Hillary can create a rubric for her, I'm just going to make up a course number, Education 431. And then she can share that rubric to the publicly shared list, and then you can copy that into your course. So for example, I actually use in the instructional design courses I teach for the annotations, because we use Hypothesis to socially annotate articles. I use a rubric that was created by the English department.
Okay,
that I
very cool.
found
Thank
through
you. I
looking.
did find them as you were talking through it. I'm so sorry I missed that. I appreciate
That's
the
okay.
reminder.
There any other questions for Hillary? Well, thank you so much, Hillary, for sharing your knowledge with the group. That was
Thank
great
you.
information for everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple minutes here before our next session. Our next session is actually fairly long, and I don't know, is there a break built into it? Okay, so we do have a break built into it, but I suggest everybody get their coffee or drink refreshed. We have some fun and interesting stuff coming up.